Hi, this is Tim Weber from South Texas College coming to you with another lecture video. Today we'll be talking about psychology, stress, and health and the relationship between those two things. So let's get an outline up there for you. You can follow along what I'm talking about. And let's get a pointer so that I can highlight what we're looking at. Okay, here we go. All right. So, oops, there it is. Okay. All right. So first of all, let's have a look at what's coming up in the first section here. Get my face out of the screen. And so we'll be trying to answer the questions, what is stress? What is a stressor? Is stress a good thing? What is the general adaptation syndrome? And what are the most common types of stressors? So first of all, psychologists have defined stress as a process by which we appraise our environment and perceive that there are threats or challenges, things that challenge our ability to adjust. So, stress being a process involves actually deciding what things in an environment mean in such a way that there's some need to make a change, which may involve some difficulty on our part. Now, that said, things that could bring on this stress process may or may not, given how we think about them. And so, for example, maybe you have to take a difficult math test. And if you then appraise that situation as being a threat to you, that this is horrible, there's not a chance that I can do this, and something terrible is going to happen to me as a result. I'm going to fail the test, therefore I'm going to fail out of college, and on and on. You're likely be stressed to the point of distraction, distracted by all of these frightening feelings to the point where you won't even be able to apply what you do know. So we consider that to be a stress response. Now, on the other hand, that difficult math test, you might approach that as being a challenge. You might say, well, boy, this is tough. I'm just going to have to throw everything at it that I have. And I'm just going to give it a shot, see what I can do. And however it comes out, it comes out. And lo and behold, given that attitude, you might be aroused to actually engage the skills you do have and be able to focus your mind on the task. And who knows, you might actually succeed. More likely, you will do better if you take that approach than if you simply approach it as a threat that's a danger to you. Now, when situations such as this are short-lived or where they're taken by us as being a challenge, these type of events then may actually have positive effects. On the other hand, if this is a severe or prolonged sort of event, this may actually have harmful effects. So the maladaptive effects of stress might come into play in that situation. So the question, is stress a good thing? You might first say, well, of course not. But in fact, psychologists have talked about two types of stress, eustress and distress. Eustress, EU being the Greek word for good, means a good stress. So this would be, for example, exercise that is difficult enough to tax us but not enough to pound us into the ground. And this would produce a positive adaptation. We get stronger. Or a test that challenges us to study and do our best. And again, we might have a positive outcome as a result of that. And we might actually better ourselves. So that's eustress. Now, distress, on the other hand, is where the event is too severe, too intense, or too prolonged, and this results in potentially damage to our health, diminishes our ability to cope in the future. Think, for example, the effects of child abuse, or the situation where the person develops PTSD due to some severe stressful event. So Walter Cannon was one of the first to identify one of the major stress response systems, which he referred to as the fight or flight response. Now, there are many mechanisms that are part of this. As you can see, the brain, our endocrine system is involved with this fight or flight response. Oh, by the way, fight or flight response, what is that? We appraise that we are being threatened, and so our body prepares itself to fight against that threat or to flight, run away. So as you can see, our brain, our endocrine system, our glands are involved with this, our heart or nervous system. You can see that there are going to be hormones such as epinephrine, norepinephrine produced by our adrenal glands that flood our bloodstream in order to cause our heart to beat faster, cause us to breathe more deeply, cause our muscles to tense up, um, gives us more capability to fight or run away. The liver releases glucose and various lipids, fats into the bloodstream for quick energy, and pain is dulled. So this sort of fight or flight response is very useful if you're facing a sudden physical threat, such as being chased by a tiger. On the other hand, what we're going to find is this is not well suited to long-term sorts of threats that we might face, as we'll see in a bit. Nonetheless, very useful if we're suddenly faced with a major physical threat. Now, in similar cases, faced with a threat, there are other responses that can be made. The freezing response, the person is paralyzed by fear. We see this in animals too. And normally that's followed by that fight or flight response. The freeze seems to be a matter of gathering up one's energies to fight or run away. But sometimes this becomes prolonged. The person freezes, they become passive, they don't try to do anything about the situation, or maybe they become depressed. It's sort of a psychological way of freezing up in the face of some threat. A third response that can occur to some threat would be tend befriend response. So in this response, the person nurtures relationships with others, helps others, interacts with others for support. And this then calms, relieves anxiety, and so this is all mediated through the release of this hormone and neurotransmitter called oxytocin, which is involved with our bonding with other people, social interactions that are positive. Interestingly enough, oxytocin also released by massage. Maybe that's why it's so anxiety relieving. So there is a third potential response to uh, the threat or stressor. Back in 2001, some time ago, I actually gathered up all of the research on this particular response and put it together in a big paper. If you're interested in that paper, let me know and I'll try to dig it up for you. Okay, now, so another way of approaching this was proposed by Hans Selye back in the 1950s, a physiologist. And he came out with this idea called the general adaptation syndrome. So this was a three-phase, non-specific response to prolonged stressors. So notice this occurs where one is under stress for a prolonged period of time, and non-specific, so the same response occurs no matter what the stressor is. The three phases, alarm, resistance, and exhaustion, are shown below. So the first phase, the alarm phase, we realize that there is something that is threatening to us. And so our body begins to mobilize the resources to cope with that stressor. So the stress hormones pour into the bloodstream, the blood chemistry changes, blood clotting increases, and everything is ramped up, heart rate and respiration, and so on. So phase two occurs as we are now successfully coping with the stressor. That's good. But as this goes on longer and longer, we're also burning through the body's resources for dealing with emergencies and stressors. So eventually, if it continues long enough, we enter phase three, which is the exhaustion phase. The body's reserves for dealing with the stressor are now exhausted, and we begin to see a decline in functions of the body, mental processes. So the person now in this exhaustion phase becomes more prone to disease, illness, accidents, depression, and other mental disorders. If this continues long enough without relief, the ultimate response will be death. So pretty scary kind of thing, right? So let me give you some sense of maybe how this might play out for maybe a student. I had a student a few years back who I had noted had not been coming to class, was not able to contact them. And lo and behold, a couple months after they disappeared, they showed up at my office and they said, well, I'm here and I want to catch up on my class so that I can finish the semester. Actually, it was more than a couple months that they missed. And so I said, well, what happened? And they said, well, I was real busy. I'm a high school student as well as college student. I have full high school course load and also a full college course load here at STC. As a matter of fact, I had an overload. I was taking extra courses beyond a full course load, and I was working full time. And I started getting panic attacks. And so she said, I quit coming to class because of that. And I said, oh, well, is that any better? She says, well, there's more. She said, besides that, she said, I also work full time as well on top of that. And then my sister had a miscarriage, and so I was trying to help her kind of cope with that. And I also have a nephew who has a disability who I'm helping with. And a couple weeks ago, she said, I tried to kill myself. And so I said, well, so have you talked to anybody about those feelings that led you to try to kill yourself? And she says, well, yes, they put me in the hospital and a psychiatrist came and talked to me a bit and prescribed me some medication. And so I think I'll be fine. So I'm going to get back to things. And I said, well, I'm not sure if you're ready to really jump right back in. I said, back when you started getting those panic attacks, I think, well, maybe your body was trying to tell you something. Maybe it was trying to tell you that you're really trying to take on a little bit too much and you need to take a step back. And I said, have you talked to anybody about any of that, about any of those things that happened before your suicide attempt? She said, no, I didn't. I said, well, before we talk about you catching up on your coursework, I want you to go talk to somebody, licensed professional counselor, psychologist, even psychiatrist again, and talk about, the kind of schedule you're keeping and just kind of see what they have to say. And so she went ahead, she said, okay, I'll do that. So about a week went by, and lo and behold, she came back and she said, you know what? I went and I talked to a licensed professional counselor a little bit. And as I talked with them, I really got the sense that, I really was trying to do too much. And she said, I'm going to take it a bit slower now and try to sort of recover. So notice what happened is that, yes, she had worn through all of her resources for dealing with all of that stress, eventually getting into an exhaustion phase, her body trying to tell her, you need to back off. And she not doing so, eventually you see where she ended up. Now, a couple things we can learn. One is that you need to start being aware of when the signs of entering that exhaustion phase so that you can back up and get some relief from that stressor. Also, you should know that once you get into that exhaustion phase, and the further you get into it, it may take some considerable time to simply recover your reserves. So it's not a matter of just taking a day off sometimes and you're going to be fine. You may take longer than that, considerably longer, weeks or maybe even months in some cases, once you've gotten into that exhaustion phase, especially if you've gotten significantly into it. So I guess the thing we can take away from that is that, yes, it's good to be busy, it's good to do a lot, but also we have to know our limitations and when to back off. And that kind of brings us to sort of my model of eustress. One of the things that I have noted is I think psychologists have, well, with good reason, emphasize this side of our dealings with challenges and stress and the potential for damage. But I'd like to also consider the potential for benefit from exposure to stressors. Okay, the eustress we talked about. So partly is I also come from an athletic background. I ran track in high school and college. I actually set high school and small college records in 800 meters and mile relay team. And did martial arts and lifted weights since that time. So some of my understanding of this comes out of that, but also psychology also does bear this out, but it's just not emphasized much. So notice that eustress begins with exposure to a stressor, but at an intensity that we can effectively tolerate. Okay, think of exercise that is intense enough that it gets your body's attention. Yeah. Think of maybe what? A class that's difficult enough to challenge you, but not so difficult that you have no chance of succeeding, right? So then being challenged by that stressor at a tolerable sort of level, then there can follow a time for our body, our mind, nervous system, what have you, then to recover from that stress, to make adaptations. So the body, the nervous system has to consolidate new learning, has to make changes in physical processes. And if we allow recovery to occur, then we come back with an improved level of strength, hardiness, resilience, ability to tolerate difficult situations, to overcome bigger and bigger obstacles. So I think it's important to also consider this process and to build that into what we do. So, for example, take a hard study session, study hard, but then take a break. Allow your brain to consolidate that new knowledge. And then, as you have a higher level of knowledge, now you can move on to a more difficult topic. Or if you're afraid of speaking in front of people, you might first just start by practicing giving a speech maybe by yourself. Allow yourself, again, your nervous system to, again, consolidate that ability that you had now to give a speech alone. Then you give that speech to now one supportive person. And you then again allow your brain to consolidate that new learning that, yes, you can do that and succeed, and nothing terrible will happen to you. And then you add more supportive people, and then after recovering, adapting, then you add maybe a stranger to the group that you're going to present to, and so on until finally you find yourself capable to speak in front of a large group of people that you don't know. Now, having said all of this, there are some stimuli that are probably never going to be directly beneficial. Now, think of child abuse. That's not something that we're going to try to put to this model, right? It's never beneficial at the time. Okay. Or, yeah, I'll give you the extreme example. You're drinking a bottle of poison. No, you're not going to adapt to that, right? But there are many things, though, in life that we can use this process to make progress and to become a better person. So let's move on to the questions that what events are most likely to provoke a maladaptive stress response? And that would include catastrophes, significant life changes, and accumulated daily hassles. So first of all, catastrophes would be one-time events, short-lived, an earthquake, flood, fire, hurricane, natural disaster, a terrorist attack, auto accident, being the victim of a crime, so forth. These things do definitely produce a stress response. And for example, after earthquakes, many people report difficulty sleeping, even if they weren't harmed in the earthquake. They found increasing rates of mental disorders after various disasters, suicide rates increase, and so forth. The more a person is affected by that catastrophe, the greater the likelihood then that this is going to have a negative effect on them. For example, refugees that are created by natural disasters who've lost their homes, their everyday life is completely changed at this point, and this becomes a very significant challenge that may produce a stronger stress response in the refugee than the person who did not lose their home. Now, we also have significant life changes can produce a stress response as well. So what are we talking about? Well, things like what? Death of a loved one, a marriage or divorce, getting married or divorced, losing a job or getting a new job, getting a job promotion, leaving home to become independent, or moving to a new home, or maybe moving back home, having a new baby, experiencing an illness or surgery. All of these things are significant life changes. They result in us having to make some change in what we're doing, or some change from our routine. What they found is as people are exposed to more and more intense, significant life changes, there is then greater vulnerability to disease and illness, particularly in weeks and months after exposure to that stressor. And with severe significant life changes like the death of a loved one, they can even identify an increased risk of death in the following weeks or months. Now, we also find that when people experience clusters of significant life changes occurring in a very short period of time, people are also at higher risk of negative effects of stress. Now have a look at this chart. People in the 18, 19-year-old and 20 to 24-year-old age group reported the highest levels of stress of any age group. And interestingly enough, we find that evidence of stress related problems increases greatly when people move from childhood into adolescence and emerging adulthood and this age group. We see psychological disorders emerging that didn't show up before at this time, as people often are under greater stress. Thirdly, we have the accumulated daily hassles. So these are, they seem kind of minor, traffic, long lines, job stress, boring work, minor health irritations, maybe holding on to some unattainable goal that doesn't serve you anymore. All of these kinds of things, they're not big things, but they sort of add up. And as they accumulate, they then begin to drive up our blood pressure and eventually can add up to major stressor status. And yes, people's response differs. Some people, being very easygoing, are less affected by these than others, but everyone responds to some extent to these. Now, consider that poverty brings along with it many daily hassles. And think about that. Interestingly, people who experience poverty are at much higher risk for stress-related problems and illnesses than people of other economic groups. And to a great extent, it may be due to simply the accumulation of daily hassles and challenges. Another thing that relates to this, higher rates of high blood pressure in African Americans. So blacks on average are more likely to suffer from high blood pressure than other groups. And we think one of the reasons for that is that there is the constant threat of racism or discrimination, whether it's overt and very obvious at that moment or maybe in the back of the person's mind. And this again begins to have damaging effects as it produces a prolonged stress on that person. So let's move then to how stress affects our health in various ways. So we'll look at how excessive stress affects the heart, the immune system, and whether there are personality factors that might be linked to those effects. So first of all, heart health, we'll find that stress can contribute to coronary heart disease. This is a disease of the blood vessels that supply blood to our heart. Stress leads to elevated blood pressure, damaging the walls of those arteries and enabling plaques to accumulate more readily. And as these clog, then, if there is a lack of blood flow, then the heart is not nourished with the blood it needs. The person has a heart attack. You can see in this picture here, plaques forming in this artery, leaving only a smaller area of blood flow. In this picture, the plaques have accumulated and now a small blood clot, which normally would not be damaging, now blocks the little area that is available for blood flow. The person has a heart attack. Friedman and Ulmer years ago tracked the levels of blood lipids. Those are fats like cholesterol and top triglycerides, and the blood's clotting speed in agents in accountants' bloodstreams as April 15th approached. Say, why April 15th? Well, that's when these accountants had to have all of their clients' tax returns done. A big deadline, big annual deadline, a lot of stress. They found those blood lipids, clotting speed rose to dangerous levels as the deadline approached, the effects of stress actually affecting how their body was working. They also have found that personality characteristics influence whether this is going to happen. And two basic types of personality are identified in relationship to this. The type A person, who is competitive, hard driving, impatient, they're verbally aggressive, they attack people, they're anger prone, they get angry easily and stay angry. As opposed to the type B personality, the person being easygoing, relaxed, things don't bother them, they don't get upset easily. So they tracked 3,000 men over a 9-year period, and they found that 257 heart attacks occurred. 69% of them, the majority of them, happened to people that had basically type A personality, majority of them. Interestingly, not one person that had a pure type B personality had a heart attack. So a bit more about this higher risk type A personality, the core characteristics, a lot of negative emotions, not only just anger, but prone to other anxiety, depression, and so forth as well. But the biggest one being anger. An aggressive reactive temperament, getting angry over little things, verbally aggressive, so attacking people by saying things to them. High emotional intensity, so strong emotions. And this is accompanied by very intense sympathetic nervous system activation. So the blood flows away from the heart and liver as a result where it's needed. There is then an increase in cholesterol and blood lipids, restriction of blood flow to the heart where it's needed. These people then may get into conflict with others due to their aggression. And as that conflict alters their heart rhythms, you can have a sudden death, those with already weakened heart. So, as one of many ways this can happen. Now, you might say, well, what if you have that type A personality? Can you do anything about it? Well, you may be able to modify your emotionality to some extent, but it may be limited because to a great degree, personality has genetic component, biological component that's sort of built in. So there may be a limit to which you can change that. So what do you do then if you're type A? Well, how about suppressing your emotions and just trying to hold them back? Well, turned out when they studied this, those who suppress those emotions actually seem to worsen the effect of it, made it worse. So what are you to do if you have that type A personality? And by the way, I'm a little bit like that. I have to work at this. One of the things that they found most beneficial was to find an appropriate way to express those emotions, to find someone that they could confide in regularly to express their emotions, as well as opportunities to take a break from situations that might stimulate those emotions, and of course, other things like getting some exercise and adequate sleep, which helps us to keep our emotions in better at better levels. So there are a few things that can be done, but it takes more of a challenge. Now, other personality characteristics that may influence our health: pessimism. Turned out pessimistic men twice as likely to develop heart disease over the period of a 10-year study done by Kubzansky. Just saw an interesting article yesterday that was published. And didn't have a chance to actually include it on the outline here, but another researcher took upon himself to look at all of the research on optimism and heart disease that has been done. And in taking the best studies, they calculated that people who were optimists were 35% less likely to suffer from heart disease, cardiovascular events like heart attacks, 35% less likely. that reduction in risk is equal to what? Not smoking. It's equal to exercising regularly, like almost every day. It's equal to the person with high cholesterol taking a statin medication for their cholesterol. It's extremely, extremely significant. So consider optimism to be one of the important factors in cardiovascular health. Now, they also found depression can have significant effects. In one study, women who had no symptoms of depression over the course of the study, only 7% of them died. Women who had 6 or more symptoms of depression, though, 24% died during that course of the study. So again, a greatly elevated risk of mortality, death, just due to depression. They also have found that heart attack victims, if they become depressed, are now then 4 times more likely to suffer a repeat heart attack than those that do not become depressed. So then having a look at the relationships between stress and disease, we now have this word in our vocabulary called psychophysiological disease. Notice it's a 2-part word, psycho, so psychological, and physiological, the physical body. So what does this refer to? This refers to any stress-related physical illness where stress plays a part in the physical illness. So for example, high blood pressure, digestive disorder, some headaches. If there is a stress-related component to that physical illness, we refer to it as psychophysiological. This also has brought forth a relatively new area of study called psychoneuroimmunology. Again, this is a 3-part word. Psychological influences having an effect on our nervous system, our brain nervous system, which in turn then affects our immune system. Studying how psychological, neural, and endocrine processes in the immune system interact with one another. And so just kind of real basic course on psychoneuroimmunology. We have some very important immune cells produced by our body, such as B lymphocytes produced in the bones, fight bacteria. That's nice, easy to remember, bones and bacteria for B lymphocytes. T lymphocytes produced in the thymus gland and other places of the body, which then go around wiping out cancer cells and viruses. And we have these macrophages that get rid of foreign cells that don't belong in our body, as well as worn out cells that are not functioning as they should. And then these NK cells, natural killer cells, that go around wiping out disease cells of our body. So there are many other immune cells, but those are some very important ones. The effect of a weakened immune system is that we then are more susceptible to illness, disease, death, and decline, various types. Now, the relationship between psychology and this at one level is that when we're under stress, those stress hormones that are released have also the effect of suppressing the activity of our immune system. So as we are stressed for any length of time, then our immunity, our resistance to disease and illness decreases. Interestingly, we can demonstrate this. A study was done in which college students volunteered for an experiment in which they would be exposed to the cold virus, and they were also given a stress index which measured the level of stress that they were experiencing at that time. So they then exposed them to that cold virus and took a look at a few weeks later to see who actually developed a cold. And what they found, people who scored lowest on that stress index were only about half as likely to come down with the cold as those who reported high levels of stress at the time they were exposed to the virus. Twice as many of them actually got the cold. And I thought, wow, I'm recording this in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. And one thing they're not talking to us about is, you need to manage your levels of stress to reasonable levels, because if you allow yourself to become overstressed, if you're exposed to that coronavirus, you are more likely to contract the illness and have it get you down. We're not hearing much about that though, so maybe you can pass the word if it's still going on when you listen to this. Interestingly, stress also influences the rate of wound healing. Keikolt Glacier in 1998 did an experiment with college students who volunteered to receive a small wound on their gum of their mouth that they then could measure to see how long it took to heal. They found that if the student received that wound during finals week, it took longer to heal than during summer vacation when the students were not attending classes. So what's the difference? Obviously, finals week is much more stressful than summer vacation without classes. Now, what about the interaction between stress and cancer? Is there any? Well, the last time I looked for research on this, it appears that cancer is not directly caused by stress, doesn't directly create cancer cells. However, we all have some cancer cells in our body at any point in time. I don't want to scare you, but normally your immune system goes around and wipes out those cancer cells before they multiply and take over. So no problem. But when we're under stress, those cancer cells that we all have then potentially may be able to flourish, multiply, become tumors as our body's defenses are weakened by that stress. So that's where the stress may come in when it comes to cancer. Now, if a person has developed cancer, they also found stress reduction techniques could help them to cope more successfully with the treatments that they might have to endure, many of which are quite unpleasant. So not only does stress have a direct effect on our health, we're going to find it also may have an indirect effect through another set of mechanisms. So here we have in this diagram, persistent stressors and negative emotions then result in the release of stress hormones that then can impact our heart health, suppress the action of our immune system, causing it to malfunction, or can produce autonomic nervous system effects like headaches or high blood pressure. Now, not only that, but persistent stressors, negative emotions, can indirectly affect our health by promoting unhealthy behavior. So while feeling those negative emotions or persistent sense of stress, one might what? Smoke to try to relieve that stress, might drink too much alcohol, might not eat right, or maybe not get enough sleep. And all of these things then are going to have their own negative consequences for our health. So there's also this indirect mechanism. So as we became more aware of this, psychologists and physicians then began teaming up in what they call behavioral medicine to integrate what we've learned in psychology with medical knowledge, knowing that the mind and body interact, that everything psychological is simultaneously at some level physiological as well. So promoting health then, really, if we want to look at it most deeply, is more than just preventing or healing disease. Yes, prevention is better than wiping out disease once it appears, but what we really want is the absence of disease, prevention of it, along with helping people to achieve the best physical, mental, and spiritual state possible. That's really kind of our best optimal picture of health, not just getting up to from negative to zero, but to the positive side of thriving. And so that's one of the goals of behavioral medicine. So we're going to end this video here. The next video will pick up with coping with stress. What can we do to effectively cope with it? And various mechanisms we can use, various behaviors that help us to cope effectively. And I see I'll have to correct my spelling before then. So that's it for now. Have a great day. Go out and do something really worthwhile and give thanks for all the good things you may have. Talk to you later.